Welcome to Flatirons Online. My name is Michael, and I just gotta say, I'm so glad that you are here. And regardless of what life is throwing at you right now, I just want you to know that we are here for you. Now, what do you do when you or someone else has been wronged? We all want the bad stuff and the bad people to get what they deserve. That way the good stuff and the good people win, right? Well, our teaching pastor, Ben Foote, is going to talk about justice and how we are supposed to respond when justice isn't being served the way we think it ought to be. And it's probably not what you think. So keep watching.
My goodness. That song rocks. One more time, give it up for our band, all the bands at all the campuses. So good. I was unfamiliar with that song until this week, and it rocks. And it's just, doesn't it sound like it has to be in a James Bond movie? That's how it sounds. So I actually Google it, not in a James Bond movie, which I think is an absolute crime. But it's actually perfect because I want to talk movies with you right now. We're wrapping up this series on 1 Peter chapter 2. Let's talk movies first though, because I love movies, all right? And I know that everyone loves movies, but I'm a movie nerd, all right? I inherited this from my dad. I love almost every genre of movie. I don't like rom-coms. I'm sorry if that offends you. Okay. Buckle up. Yeah, I'm not into the whole 10 things I hate about you, you've got mail Hugh Grant thing. I'm not looking to watch anything that can be described as cute. But I do love a lot of genres of movies. If I had to pick my all-time favorite genre of movie, it's tied with two types of movies. The first one is anything that will hurt your mind, right? So movies like Inception, 12 Monkeys, Fight Club, 2001: A Space Odyssey. Do we have mind-melting movie fans in here? Okay, nice. You're my people. The other one that's tied with this, and I mean it, and don't judge me, it is samurai movies that were made in Japan in the 1950s and 60s. I know that that's very specific, but I own 30 or 40 of these. I love these movies, and I know you're judging me, and I know that you don't know what I'm talking about. I'm telling you, there's nothing better than watching a dude in a crazy, scary mask run around with a sword and cut down other dudes and drink sake. It's the best, all right? Don't knock it till you try it. One of the reasons I love samurai movies, and at this point you're still talking about this, aren't you? Yeah, it's gonna make sense. One of the reasons I love samurai movies is because most of them revolve around the idea of seeking justice. The ones I like, they're old school, they're black and white, but at the end of the day, they are revenge movies. And I can't speak for women, I think I speak for most men. Most of us guys, we love a really good revenge movie. There's something cathartic about it. America even has kind of this cultural love affair with revenge movies. Some of the most popular movies of all time are movies about seeking justice and vengeance, even if it kills you. Movies like Gladiator, movies like Braveheart. Revenge movies are some of the most popular franchise movies because we just like that story and we want them to tell it again, so they just make sequels. For example, the franchise Taken, they've made 3 of these. I don't know how Liam Neeson allows his daughter to be taken 3 times, but he does. The most recent example would be John Wick. I don't know if you've seen this. Spoiler alert in case you want to see it, I'm about to spoil something, but these are revenge movies where Keanu Reeves goes on a vengeance spree because someone killed his dog, and they plan on making 5 of them. That's insane. I know a lot of you over-care for your dogs and see them as children and stuff, but that's ridiculous, all right? But the point is that we love a good revenge movie, and I think that says something interesting about human nature. Because at the core of a revenge story, it's always that a person was wronged and they feel like no one's doing anything about it, and so they take matters into their own hands in order to serve justice. And at the end of the day, everyone in this room, everyone listening right now, regardless of what you believe when it comes to Jesus and the Bible, everyone wants justice served. We might, define justice differently, but we want justice. We want the wrong things to be made right. And we want the bad stuff and the bad people to get what they deserve so that the good stuff and the good people can flourish. And there's this sense of justice that is innate and hardwired, and I would say God-given in every single human being. This is why we get an overwhelming sense of zealous anger whenever someone wrongs us. When they do something really bad, like they cheat you, or they cheat on you, or they lie about you, or cut you out from under your knees behind your back, or even when something stupid happens. I've had this experience where someone cuts me off in traffic and then flips me off. It's like, I thought I was supposed to do the last part. Like, you cut me off. But whenever someone wrongs us, what happens? We start shaking, and you get furious. Because there's something in you that I believe is God-given that's telling you wrong things have to be made right. And someone has to be held accountable for the wrong things that have been done to me. And that thing inside of us, that piece of us that craves justice, that's what the very end of 1 Peter chapter 2 are all about. That's what we're gonna tackle today. But I have to warn you right off the bat, right? Today is one of those days where you have got to buckle up, all right? Because we are dealing with some hard and heavy truth, all right? If you're anything like me, at first glance, you are not going to like what the Bible has to say today. In fact, when Jim was like, we're just gonna teach through chapter 2 and teach every single verse, and you're gonna do these last ones, I was like, why are you going bear hunting this week? Why did you give these verses to me? I also know, though, that if we push through the uncomfortable thing, the discomfort at the beginning, by the end of this thing, I believe you will be able to see how even though this is hard and heavy truth, it can set you free. But you're gonna have to fight to not turn your heart and your mind off. And you're gonna have to push through this hard truth together with me today. Does that sound good? Sounds good to two people. I'm gonna do it anyway. You've been warned. The rule is basically leave now or stay for the whole thing so I can explain it, okay? We're picking up right where Jim left off in 1 Peter 2:18, where Peter writes this. He says, servants, be subject to your masters with all respect, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the unjust. And before I can even unpack what in the world is going on in this verse, I first have to call out an elephant in the room. Some translations of the Bible will use the word slaves instead of servants, and that would be a fair translation. At the time Peter wrote this, slavery was different than what we typically imagine. We typically imagine America's own history of slavery. During Peter's time, it looked different. Slavery was not race-based. You could purchase your own freedom. Some people would enter servanthood willingly to pay off debts. And a lot of slaves were treated as like equal, like members of a family, basically. There were many differences, but the fact remains that servants during Peter's time were people who were treated by the Roman government and society at large as property, which is wrong. But there are some people out there, people who frankly don't know what they're talking about. They will claim that the Bible condones or supports slavery. And they'll point to verses like this one and they'll go, see, it looks a lot like Peter's telling Christian slaves to just stay in their lane and that this is just their lot in life. And they'll say that. But if you actually read the whole Bible from front to back and you understand the character and nature of God and who Jesus is and what he wants to accomplish through his church, if you actually begin to know what you're talking about, you know it is certifiably insane to say that the Bible condones slavery. It just doesn't, right? The Old Testament is a historical narrative of God setting his people free from slavery. All of the language in the New Testament of the good news, like what Jesus accomplished for us, it's news of being set free from slavery. It says we're set free from being in bondage to sin and decay, and we're set free because he redeemed us. Redeem was the word for when a slave purchased their own freedom. Later in the New Testament, 1 Timothy, Paul says he puts slave trading in the same category as murder. And the biblical belief that all humans are created equal and in the image of God is the core idea that led to the abolition of slavery in all different parts of the world. I could keep going. The point right now is no, this verse and the Bible and God himself does not condone slavery, and the people who claim that simply have not done their homework. They haven't read the thing. And the reason I bring all that up is so that we can lay it aside right now and don't let it be a roadblock, so that we can figure out what in the world is happening in this verse. Again, Peter says this. He says, servants, be subject to your masters with all respect, not only to the good and gentle masters, but even also to the unjust. Why in the world would Peter say that? And my question right now is, of all the groups of people that Peter could talk to, why did he choose to talk to Christian servants or slaves? Here's the first reason I think Peter addresses Christian servants. It's because if this command, and we're gonna dig into the command in just a second, but if this command applies to Christian slaves, it means that no other Christian is exempt from this commandment. If it's true for Christian slaves, it's true for every Christian. In other words, if Peter addressed a different social group in this verse, if he goes, hey, for those of you who are in positions of really high leadership and really high responsibility, you should repay injustice with good. If he were to address a more like socially privileged group of people, then you and I could feel like we're off the hook. You and I could feel like, hey, that might be true. That's like a hard truth, but that might be true of governors or presidents or principals or CEOs, you name it, because they're called to a higher standard. But I'm off the hook because I don't live like that, so I can get payback, and that's good because my in-laws are nuts or whatever. You could let yourself off the hook. I think that's one of the reasons that he addresses Christian slaves. Basically, Peter is saying this is a command for every Christian. Here's the other reason I think he addressed Christian slaves. It's because it's shocking. It's just as shocking now as it would have been back in Peter's day. When Peter says that Christian slaves should continue treating unjust masters with kindness and respect, there's not a single person in this room, myself certainly included, who hears that and goes, yeah, that makes sense. No, doesn't make sense. It's shocking. What we want Peter to say is that Christian slaves can get a pass. Everyone else, you gotta go repay evil with good, but you guys are off the hook. You get a pass. To reference movies, what I want Peter to say is, hey, Christian slaves, you have permission to go Django Unchained on everybody's butts, all right? The rest of you repay evil with good. You're off the hook because you're suffering, but he doesn't say that. It's the other reason I think Peter addresses Christian slaves. He's trying to get us to feel as shocked as we should feel about how radical this command is. By addressing Christian slaves, he's not just saying it's a command for every Christian, he's saying this is a radical command for every Christian. What is the radical command? Well, if I only wanted to go halfway, and part of me does, but if I wanted to go halfway, I would say the command is this: do not take matters into your own hands by repaying evil with more evil. So don't follow the plot of every revenge movie you've ever seen by, replying to evil with more evil. But that's going halfway. That's me kind of pulling a punch right now. If we're to go all the way, and this is the first of our hard truths today, like push through it and lean in. If we're gonna go all the way, the radical command for every Christian is this: when faced with injustice, when someone does you wrong, do not repay evil with more evil. Instead, repay evil with good. It's radical because it's not just a command to not do something. In this case, hey, don't go seek revenge. Instead, it's a command to do something, to repay evil with good. And before you think I'm misreading or I'm misinterpreting, this idea and this command is found all over the Bible. Right? If you go to Romans 12, a different part of the Bible, Paul commands us the same thing in different language. He uses stronger language. Paul says this, he goes, "Beloved, never avenge yourselves. Instead, leave it to the wrath of God. For it's written, vengeance is mine, I'll repay," stuff like that, says the Lord. So don't go seek vengeance. Instead, to the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. And if he's thirsty, give him something to drink. For by so doing, you will heap burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but instead overcome evil with good. That revenge movie has never been made. All right? No one kills Keanu Reeves' dog, and then Keanu Reeves goes out there and he gets payback by getting to his enemies and inviting them to Chili's and paying dinner for them. That movie doesn't exist. We cannot wrap our minds around this. I can't. But the reason Peter and Paul are saying something so radical in the first place is because this is how Jesus told us to live our lives. Jesus said it like this: you've heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. So if someone hits you, you gotta hit them back. You've heard said, here's what I'm gonna say to you. I say, do not resist the evil one, the one who is evil. But if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. And if anyone would sue you and take your tunic, if they're gonna take your t-shirt, go ahead and give them your hoodie as well. And if they're gonna force you to go 1 mile, do them one better and go 2 miles. Like, we have no category for this. I mean, it feels anti-American. It sounds crazy and backwards and countercultural because it is. But it is a radical command for every Christian. When faced with injustice, do not repay evil with more evil. That's how the rest of the world works. Instead, you're gonna repay evil with good. Makes us cringe. I'll be honest, maybe not you. For me, makes me cringe. All right, and the reason that it makes me cringe is because at first glance, I do not understand how this command could be anything other than weak and passive and unfair. At first glance, it seems like this command goes against what I said at the beginning I believe is God-given. A sense of justice needs to happen. But over the next few verses, Peter begins explaining how, if you believe in Jesus, this command is not weak and unfair, it is instead strong and just. Look at this, next few verses, Peter goes into more detail about this. He says, you gotta repay evil with good, and then he says this, and if you like to mark your Bibles up, get your pencils ready, right? He says, for this is a gracious, other translations will say commendable, which I like. You can write commendable above gracious. He goes, for this is a gracious or commendable thing when mindful of God, circle mindful of God. We're gonna come back to it, but those 3 words are the key to understanding this verse. Peter says this is a gracious and commendable thing when mindful of God, one endures sorrows while suffering unjustly. For what credit is it if when you sin and you're beaten for it, you endure? All right, so if you do something wrong and you pay for it, like what reward are you expecting? He goes, on the other hand, if when you do good and suffer for it, you endure, this is a gracious or commendable thing in the sight of God. If you do the right thing and still pay for it, God will commend you for that. And it's starting to make a little more sense in my mind, all right? Because for me, for example, if my son Micah comes home from school and he's got a big old black eye and I ask him what happened and he tells me, well, I was bullying this kid all day long, picking on him for hours and hours until he got fed up and he turned around and he socked me in the eye. If he tells me that, well, you paid for doing the wrong thing, like he's in trouble. On the other hand, if Micah comes home with a black eye and I'm like, what happened to you? And he goes, well, there's this bully picking on this other kid and I stepped in to protect the other kid and the bully hit me in the eye. At that point, I'm commending him. He paid for doing the right thing, but I'm gonna tell him, buddy, good job. I'm proud of you. I'm sorry you got a black eye, but I'm proud of you. The result is the same. Micah is wronged. He has a black eye. But the reason for the black eye changes everything. Starts to make a little more sense, but why would we live this way? That's what Peter says next. He goes, for to this you have been called. And before I can even finish this verse, I have to make a distinction right now. I have to take a time out. We have been called to this, commanded to this. What is the this? Well, we have been commanded to repay evil with good. But I have to make a distinction right now, and some of you have to listen to me. The command here is we are not commanded to stay put in an unjust, unsafe situation that's harming us if we have the power to free ourselves from it. And right now, I am thinking about and talking to, with a tender heart, anyone who has in the past or in the present suffered situations of physical or emotional abuse. Jesus is not saying that to you. He's not saying you just gotta be a trooper and stick the thing out. It would be twisted. All right, Jesus is not twisted. That's not what he's saying. If you have the ability to free yourself from a harmful situation, do it. All right? His command is not to just stay put. Instead, this is a command for after the damage has been done. Right? For those of us who have been wronged and we're trying our best to pick up the broken pieces of our lives, our command is to repay evil with good. All right, back to the verse, why would we do that? Peter says, "For to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example so that you might follow in his steps." Right, the only reason we would ever not get revenge, not get payback, not get even, but instead repay evil with good is because this is how Jesus lived his life, and if he's your king, he's commanding you to follow in his footsteps. That's why we would live this way. But again, I understand the why. Right? I should live this way because Jesus lived this way. Sunday school answer, my problem's not the why, my problem is the how. How is this command not just weak and unfair? And that's what Peter explains next. First off, he's gonna explain how this command is not weakness. Peter says this, he goes, he, Jesus, committed no sin, neither was deceit found in his mouth. So Jesus did nothing wrong. In fact, he only did good and he still paid for it. But still, at the same time, when he was reviled, he did not revile in return. And when he suffered, he did not threaten. Peter is reminding us that Jesus lived this way and Jesus ain't weak. When you think of Jesus suffering unjustly and being beaten for doing the wrong thing, you don't think of weakness, you think of strength. And when Jesus was hanging on the cross and breathing his last, and he still chose to pray for the people who were executing him, you don't think weakness, you think strength. And Peter's reminding us of that. He goes, this command to repay evil with good, it's not weakness because this is how Jesus lived his life, and he lived his life in strength. All right, so it can't be weak. But the other question, is it unjust? Is it unfair? And what we're really asking when we ask that question, even though we don't want to say it out loud, what we're asking is all this evil in the world gonna go unpunished? And Peter says, no, which is what he tackles next. Look at this. Peter says when he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but instead, circle this part, he continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly. Circle that part, draw a line to the mindful of God part that you circled. I'll explain the connection in a minute. Peter continues, he says, he, Jesus himself, bore our sins in his body on the tree that we might die to sin. Sin won't have power over us anymore. We're forgiven. We can live to righteousness. And it's by Jesus' wounds, the fact that he suffered unjustly is what helped us to be healed. What does this have to do? How is this Peter explaining that this command is not unfair or unjust? Let me explain that. A few verses ago, remember, he said, hey, this whole repaying evil with good thing, it's a gracious thing when mindful of God. One endures sorrows while suffering unjustly. In other words, repaying evil with good can be understood as strength, and not just strength, but justice, only if we're mindful of God. What are we supposed to be remembering about God? Well, according to Peter, we're supposed to be remembering the same thing that Jesus was remembering while he was hanging on a cross. We set our minds on, we remember that God will judge everything justly. He will judge everything justly, which means he'll judge everything in a way that every member of the party, innocent party and guilty party, will look at it and they'll go, that makes sense. That's not unfair. He will judge everything justly. And again, if I wanted to go halfway, I'd stop there, but we're here now anyway, so let's just go all the way. Let's keep pushing into this idea, all right? God is very clear with us that there's bad news. All right, the bad news is that the wages of sin is death. All right, but it's the bad news that makes the good news so good. The good news is that the free gift, it's totally free. The free gift of God is eternal life in Christ Jesus our Lord. So the bad news is that the wages of sin is death, which means every stupid thing you and I have ever done, every tinge of jealousy, every insult, every act of rebellion and disobedience, like every time you and I have missed the mark of perfection, which is all of the time, he says the bad news is that the just payment for that is death. In light of that, that's why the good news is good. The good news is that God went out of his way to ensure that you and I don't have to cough up that payment ourselves. He paid it for us. This is why Jesus chose to die for us. He chose to pay the wages of your sin through his death so that you don't have to. And the only thing you have to do for that to be true for you is put your faith in him. That's it. All you got to do is say, I don't understand everything about you, Jesus. I don't have any of my life figured out, but I do believe you are who you say you are. I believe you're the Son of God, that you died for me. I want to follow you around. If you do that, forgiven. You don't have to pay that payment anymore. It's the gospel. It's good news. And we love talking about and hearing about and thinking about the good news. But the truth is we hate hearing about or thinking about the bad news, but we have to talk about it right now because Peter is talking about it right now. We got to talk about the bad news. At the same time, the bad news, if I'm being honest, it's the reason that any Christian worth their salt has a sense of urgency about them. All right? It's why Jim and I and our staff and our volunteers, we feel urgent right now. It's actually not because I believe Jesus wants to make life better for you in the here and now, even though I believe that's true. It's actually not because Jesus gives you a way to view your life that makes sense, even though I believe that's true. All of those things are true, but that's not why I feel urgent. I feel urgent because I desperately need you to know, I need you to hear that if you don't put your faith in Jesus, you are about to pay the wages of your sin yourself. And I don't want that for you. And God doesn't want that for you. That's why he went to great lengths to pay it himself. But at the same time, we got to talk about it because it's this combination of the bad news that makes the good news so good. Peter says that's the only way you and I could ever live out this radical command if we remember that stuff. Remember our radical command. When faced with injustice, when someone does you wrong, you don't repay evil with evil, you repay evil with good. Peter says the only way we can see that command as not weak and unfair, but instead strong and just, is if, like Jesus, we remember that God will judge everything justly. Which means, and this is the hardest part of our hard truth today, keep pushing through with me. What it means is that there is not one single act of sin or evil or wrong that has ever occurred in the history of this planet that will go unpunished. Everything will be judged and judged justly by God. And the wages of every single sin will be paid and accounted for. And here's what that means. It means if you have suffered an injustice, if something deeply wrong has happened to you, Peter is reminding you, even though it's a hard truth, that only one of two things will happen. All right? The first thing that could happen, it's the best case scenario. It's the gospel. It's the good news. It's what we long for. The best case scenario is that the person who did you wrong will put their faith in Jesus, and Jesus will allow his death to serve as their payment, which means that they will be every bit as undeservingly forgiven as you and I are. And even if you can't get there quite today or maybe ever because of how bad this person hurt you, technically as Christians, we desire that for everyone. It's the gospel, it's the good news. But Peter's reminding you, one of two things will happen. Either the gospel or the thing we don't like talking about, the worst case scenario, the bad news. The bad news is the person who did you wrong will refuse to believe in Jesus up until the day they die. And when they die, their death will be eternal, and their own death will pay the wages for their own sin. And as Christians, we do not desire that for anybody. Keep pushing with me. But at the end of the day, Peter is reminding us that those are the only two options. And what that means for you is if you've been deeply wounded, he's saying, here's the one thing that will never, ever happen to you, is you having to suffer an injustice that God will choose to ignore or forget or let go unpunished. He said, someone's gonna pay for the wrong that has been done to you. He's not forgotten about you. Someone's gonna pay for it. Our prayer, our hope as Christians is that the person who pays for it is Jesus. And it's such a hard and heavy truth And if you're not currently feeling like you've been deeply wronged, I know, you're sitting here and you're going, I just came to church on the wrong day. I could have watched pregame football or whatever. Like if that's you, I get it. But there are people in the room who need to hear this right now. It is the people that we've been deeply wronged and we have spent years trying to pick up the broken pieces of a life that someone else shattered for us. I didn't even shatter it myself. And if that's you, you have to hear this truth about God today. If I were to sum it up, everything that Peter just taught us in my own words, it would be this. God is promising that he will not sweep any of your pain under the rug. He will not do it. I know it feels like that sometimes, but God has not forgotten about you, and he's not turned his back on your suffering, and he will not sweep the wrong things that have happened to you under the rug. He will make all the wrong things right again. He has a plan for justice, and he has promised that someone will pay the wages for the wrong things that have been done to you. And that's why he offered to pay it himself. And even though it's a hard truth, and it's a heavy truth, Jesus thought it was a truth that could set us free. How could that truth set us free? Well, because it means this. If you've been deeply, deeply wronged and you believe this to be true, it means you can let go of that crushing, suffocating desire for vengeance and justice that you're probably not gonna see this side of eternity. You can let go of it because God is saying, I'll judge it justly. God is saying, you don't have to take matters into your own hands. I promise I have taken them into my own and I will judge justly. God is saying that he will not sweep any of your pain under the rug, and that should be freedom for us. Because here's the truth, all right? For some of us, this is gonna sound very familiar right now. All right, we want justice to be done for what's happened to us, but we're not seeing it in the here and now. And so what happens is we get trapped in this never-ending, always snowballing state of anger, and we start to justify our anger and we justify our hatred. Why? Because wrong things got to be made right, and this thing hasn't been made right yet. So you're trapped in this anger. And if you let that go, eventually it devolves into deeply rooted bitterness, right? You're just disgusted with everything and everyone and every minute of your life. And if you let the bitterness go, eventually it devolves into self-pity and a false sense of martyrdom. And you start telling yourself stuff like, nothing good ever happens to me. And then if you let the martyrdom devolve, it devolves into cynicism. Eventually you just say stuff like, nothing good ever happens. Period. And before you know it, if left unchecked, you are trapped. You're trapped in this self-perpetuating, never-ending state of oppression and weakness, which is no good because it means not only did you have to suffer for the wrong that was done to you in the past, but you're having to continue suffering for it in the present. It's no good. And this is a tough pill to swallow, but it's the truth. Right? The truth is that your never-ending cycle of anger and bitterness and martyrdom and cynicism, it's not earning you justice. It's not even causing any pain or retribution for the person who hurt you. It is only hurting yourself. And some of us have been there. Some of us are there now, or we at the very least, we know someone who's walking through this right now. It's hard and it's heavy truth. But this radical command from Jesus to repay evil with good and leave justice in his hands, it is an invitation to live with him in freedom. He is asking you to trust him, to trust that he has not forgotten about you and the things that you've suffered, to trust that it will be paid for, to trust that he paid for it, and to trust that justice will be served, hopefully through his death. And if you can trust that, you can live in strength again. You don't have to be chained to the past anymore. You don't have to be chained to the anger and bitterness and martyrdom and cynicism that have not served you well. Because you can trust that God will not sweep any of your pain under the rug. He is not turning a blind eye to the wrong things that have happened to you. Now let me wrap this up. All right, hard and heavy truth, but there's some of us in here right now, we're nodding, and we're saying to ourselves, yep, I gotta be honest, I have been trapped in anger and bitterness for years because of something that has happened to me in the past, and I do wanna be set free, and I'm willing to trust Jesus on his promise that this is the way to be free from it. If that's you, how do we do that? How do we practice that? And I wanna give you 3 steps to consider taking. These are not easy steps. This is hard homework. It's not the kind of thing you're gonna have accomplished by this afternoon, but it is the path to freedom. 3 steps to begin repaying evil with good. Listen to me, I know already you're gonna think I'm crazy for the first one I'm gonna say. I'm gonna walk through these backwards actually, okay? The 3rd step is the hardest step, I know that. But the step is this: ask Jesus to help you forgive those who have wronged you. Hear me out. I know that sounds crazy, but Jesus promised, and I've witnessed it in my life, I've witnessed it in the lives of others. It's this kind of forgiveness that has the power to set you free. You don't even have to see this person to do it. For some of us, it's not safe to go and talk to this person. You can still forgive them. Ask Jesus to help you forgive the people that wronged you. Do they deserve your forgiveness? Absolutely not. This forgiveness isn't about them. This kind of forgiveness is about you being set free from anger and bitterness and martyrdom and cynicism so that you can move forward again. Ask Jesus to help you forgive those who have wronged you. I know a lot of you think I'm insane. The only reason you could ever get to that place is only if you did step 2, which comes right before it. Second step is this: ask Jesus to convince you that he will not sweep your pain under the rug. Ask him to make you absolutely convinced of that. Not just to sit on a Sunday in a church and go, I've never thought of it that way, but to be convinced about it and live your life that way, to be convinced that God will judge everything in your life justly and he has not forgotten about your pain. Ask him to convince you of that. And then again, before we can even do that, we have to start in the starting place with the first step, which is this: ask Jesus to remind you that his death already paid for your sin. It's only possible to one day next week or next month or next year or next decade, it's only possible to radically forgive someone else if you first remember that Jesus radically forgave you. You gotta start from that place of humility and that place of gratitude if you're ever gonna be able to move forward from the pain of your past. And in fact, the very last verse of 1 Peter chapter 2 is all about that. It's about reminding you of what Jesus did for you. And he brings us back to this place of humility and gratitude. The very last verse of chapter 2, Peter says this. He goes, "For you were straying like sheep at one point." Now, I don't know about you. I for sure was totally, bitterly broken, totally turned around, lost, wandering. He goes, you were like that one time. You were straying like sheep, but now because of the good news, you've returned to the shepherd and the overseer of your souls. Peter is reminding you of what Jesus has done for you. And one of the ways that we, as Christians, remind ourselves of what Jesus has done for us and the fact that he paid the wages of our sin through his death is by taking communion together. And that's what we're gonna do right now. In a sec, I'm gonna pray, and then we'll sing one more song, and then we'll take communion together. But as we do that, what we're gonna be thinking about today is how at one point in time, we were once straying like sheep, totally lost, totally turned around. But because of the good news, we have returned to I love the word, the term, the overseer of your souls. He oversees everything. He sees all. He's seen every wrong thing that has ever happened to you, and he has not forgotten about it. And he's seen every wrong thing that you've done, and he's forgiven it. He is overseeing your entire life, and he's not going to stop now. And he promises he will not sweep your pain under the rug. God, that is a heavy and hard truth, but it's the truth. You said not to shy away from truth, even when it gets heavy and it gets hard. And God, what I'm praying for right now is that could you please help us to see how ultimately, even though it's heavy and even though it's hard, this truth can set us free. God, there are some people in here, and I've been there before. I'll be there again at some point. There are people in this room who are so bitterly broken. We're trying so hard to pick up the pieces of our lives. We're filled with anger and bitterness and martyrdom and self-loathing and cynicism. God, like we just don't know what to do about it anymore. And you're trying to graciously, patiently lean in and say, just trust me with that. Give me all that emotion, and then give me the wrong thing that has happened to you, because I will give it justice. It's a hard truth, but God, it has the potential to set us free. God, it's radical what you're asking us to do. And so I know that when I get up here and I say something that sounds insane as forgive your enemies, just like you said, forgive your enemies, I know that there are people out here who are like, that's madness. God, I'm asking, would you please give us the strength and the courage and the ability to just start with step one right now, to be reminded of how much you've already done just for us, and that your death has paid the wages of our sin. God, thank you for being the overseer of our souls. And I pray this in your son's name, Jesus Christ. Amen.
Hey everyone, thanks again for joining us here at Flatirons Church Online. If you didn't know, we stream every weekend and we're dropping content throughout the week, and so be sure to subscribe to our channels. Now, if you want to support Flatirons and its ministry here, reaching people in a lost and broken world, we'd love for you to hit that Give Now button. Thanks again for being here, and we can't wait to see you either online or in person next week.